My sermon today is 7 heads and 10 horns and God's people. This is part 2. I don't know if you remember part 1, but what I'm going to do is do a very quick recap. I won't labour on it because I want to get onto the second part. But if you recall, we ask why we see in these symbols, why does God use some of these symbols? Because sometimes these symbols can be very quite confusing. And why does God use these symbols? And rather than just coming out and saying, such a power will rise, America will rise, or the Pope will rise, or whoever rises, why does he just come out and say it? Well, the answer is quite simple. If I told you that you were going to go out the front and a Ford sedan will come along and hit you, what are the chances of you going outside and walking out in the street? Be none. That's right. By foretelling the future, you change the future. So what God does is he uses symbols. So when the event happens, we look back on these things and go, oh, he knew exactly what was going to happen. So we find that when we look at the images, like, for example, in Daniel, when we have the earthly empires, that it would all, from our point of view, when we look back, we can see that God foreknew all these things were going to happen, therefore developing confidence in what God has predicted for the future. Now, there are some important things when we look at these prophecies, because we have a look, for example, in the book of Daniel. That starts from 457 BC right through till the end of time. As you can see there in verse 29, it says, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came upon thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter? And that he shall reveal a secret, maketh known unto the king what shall come to pass. So with Daniel, it starts from the time of Babylon. But in Revelation, we find that it starts from around about 68 or 96 AD, depending on who you speak to, through to the end of time, because we find in Revelation 1:1 it says, to show unto his servants a thing which must shortly come to pass. So we have 2 reference points with Daniel from the time of Babylon, and with John, it's from the time of Rome. One other important thing we find when we come to interpreting prophecy is that, you know, God, even though he foreknows the future, he doesn't just say, oh, there will be the nation of Australia, the nation of Fiji, or the nation of the US, or whatever other nations that might come to pass. He has a particular focus. And you'll find in Isaiah 45, he says, 45:11, he says, ask me of things to come concerning my sons and concerning the works of my hands, command ye me. So we find what happens is the focus of all these prophecies is God's people. So we're going to find that all these kingdoms that are in the prophecies are the major players who are affecting God's people. And you're going to see this when we look at the prophecies, that God's church is at the core. God's people is at the core of all these prophecies. So we find that the title of my sermon is 7 Heads and 10 Horns. We find that each of these prophecies we're dealing with have these 7 heads and 10 horns in them. So we find the first time we see the 7 heads and 10 horns at the prophecy of Daniel, chapter 7, even though it may not be obvious, but you can see there are 7 heads there with the lamb, the lion, the bear and the leopard and the nondescript beast with the 10 horns. But we find these in Revelation 12 as well. There's the dragon with the 7 heads and 10 horns. And in Revelation 13 we find we have the beast, the composite beast they call it. We're made up of all different parts with the 7 heads and 10 horns. And then we have in Revelation 17 the woman on the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. So we see a consistent theme. So first of all, what we have to try and find out is, what is God communicating? Well, numbers in the Bible have a meaning, and I don't want to go into it, just recap everything, or else I might as well give you the same sermon I did last time I was here. But they have a meaning. And what those meanings are, we have 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, I have said these over and over again. If I called out to you, I'm expecting you to give me the correct answer. What is the number 10 a symbol of? A test. Now, that's what I like to hear. Boom, a test. How do we know this? Because we look at what the Bible, how God uses it. So we find in Numbers 14 verse 22, it says, because of those men who seen my glories and did my miracles, which I did in Egypt in the wilderness, and have tempted or tested me now these 10 times, have not hearkened unto my voice. And the last time God uses it is in Revelation 2 verse 10. He says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, and ye shall be tried or tested and have tribulation 10 days. So we see that the first and last time God used it, that's how he uses it. And we find in the middle, we find all these things. So we find how many commandments are there? There are 10 commandments to test you're tested with. How many degrees did the sundial go back? 10 degrees. How much tithe are you supposed to give? 10%. So we can see it over and over again, how 10 virgins are tested. The classic is in Daniel, of course. How many days were there for the health message? 10 days he gave it. And when Nebuchadnezzar tested them, how many times smarter were they? 10. So you can see God uses that over and over and over again. So whenever we see the number 10 in any prophecy, what is that automatically telling us? There's a test. And when we see the number 7, we also see that in the first time it's used and the last time it's used, in Genesis 2:2, God ended and created his work and rested on the 7th day. So we can see that this means something was finished or complete. Completion, that's correct. And in Matthew 18 verse 21, it says, how oft shall I forgive my brother? Until 7 times? And Jesus said unto him, 7 times, until 7 times, but 70 times 7. Here God is re-educating that, hammering home that the number 7 means it's finished, it's complete. It's rounded. So when we put the two of those together, what would that mean? When you have the numbers 10 and number 7 together, it means it's the test is complete or finished. So we're going to see that what the purpose of these powers, these kingdoms we're seeing, is to give God's people a complete or finished test. So when we look at these now, we're going to go through these prophecies with that in mind. Be that as it may, have you ever wondered, the beginning when Israel was birthed as a nation, how many plagues were they when they were delivered? 10 plagues. And when we're finally delivered from this world, how many plagues are there? No, there's 7. We have the 7 last plagues. You have the 10 plagues of Egypt when Israel became a nation, and when Israel is finally delivered, how many plagues are there? 7. So you can see that the time of testing is now finished. It's not just in the prophecies that we have there. It's the Bible symbols everywhere tell us that there is a time of testing that will be finished for us. So when we have a look at the book of Daniel, we have to find out, well, if there's a test, what kind of test is it? Because the book of Daniel covers the history from Babylon through to the end, and so does Revelation from the time of Rome to the end. Will the test be different? Will the prophecies be different? In other words, will they have the same message, or will they have different messages? They'll have the same message. They'll be consistent throughout the thing. They might give you more information, but they're going to have the same thing. In other words, you're not going to have Daniel telling you there's going to be Russia, and the other one, another prophecy tells you, no, it's not Russia, it's Iraq. It's going to be consistent. Continuity, that's correct. So what we have a look here now is we find that in the book of Daniel, it's going to give us the clues as to what's going to happen in the future. So we find in the image of Daniel and in Daniel chapter 7, how many 10s do we find? There's 3. We tend to only think of there's only 2, but there's actually 3. The first one we have isn't even mentioned, but it's implied. Because when we look at that, we know this is an image of a man, true? And we talks about his 10 toes. So what other 10s does he have? He has the 10 fingers. So was there a test, and what era, what time in history was the arms of the chest and arms of silver? What time? It was, that's right, it was the king of Persia. So we're looking, did God's people go through a test in the time of the Persian Empire? And the answer to that is quite simply yes. And what was that test? Can you think of it? Even though I've got it up there, it should be obvious. It is the time of Esther. And what happened in the time of Esther? Can anyone give me just a quick summary? Yes, they were the universal death decree, if you want to give it like just a quick summary. There was a death decree that came, and what brought about that universal death decree? It was because Mordecai wouldn't worship Haman. And interestingly enough, how many sons did Haman have? 10 sons. Do you think that was a coincidence? No, it's here God is hammering home a message. There was a test. So the first test that came upon, in this prophecy that is, came upon the Israelites is that a universal death decree on over worship. Who do you worship? So theoretically speaking, what should we see consistently through all the other prophecies? Should be the same thing. A universal death decree over who you worship, brought about by who you worship. So we look now in Daniel chapter 7, and we find that we have the 10 horns. Now this is very interesting because the 10 horns come in under what kingdom? The fourth beast is what kingdom? It's the Roman kingdom, that's correct. So we find the Roman Empire and the Roman Emperor Constantine. Now this is very interesting because what did Constantine do? Constantine actually instigated the very first Sunday law. What he did was he made a civil on March 7, and interesting that, the Ides of March, that March 7 in 321 AD, reads, on the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in the cities rest, and let all the workshops be closed. This is the first of the series of steps taken by Constantine and by later Christian emperors regulating Sunday observance. So he made that. You might say, well, what's the significance of that? Because a few years later, about 11 years later, it says that the early believers kept Saturday and the Sabbath until March 7, when Pope Constantine, we call him Pope Constantine, but Emperor Constantine, passed a law requiring believers worship on Sunday, the day of pagan worship. Believers still kept the Saturday as a Sabbath until another law was passed 11 years later. This law signed into decree by the Pope Constantine forbidding believers to worship on Sabbath day. And it was punishable by what? Death. So you can see that the problem there, so they instigated a Sunday law back then. So how did it first start? Were you threatened with death when it first introduced? No, you'd be persecuted somewhat, but then eventually it came about that if you continued worshipping on Sabbath, you're going to pay with your life. Would you have a problem? I wouldn't have a problem having an extra day of rest. But you think Satan is happy with that? No. He wants you to work, keep his day off, and he wants you to work on the Sabbath. So here we're starting to see a pattern forming. So we can see that the early church, the early Christian church was tested, and did it pass or fail that test? It failed that test. It lost its first love, as it says in Revelation 2. They lost their first love and they compromised. And as a result of that compromise, what gave birth? The papacy came along. That's right. The papacy came along. The little horn power, and uprooted 3 of those horns, and then it then reigned for 1260 years. And we find now in Daniel chapter 2, if we go back to there, the third 10, we find that consistently, just like it did in Daniel chapter 7, we find that we have the toes. And how many toes do we have? Provided you have normal feet, you're going to have 10 toes. That's correct. So that tells us, is that the beginning, middle, or the end of the image? The end. So that tells us that at the end of time there's going to be another test. And in what kingdom is that going to be in? Well, first off, it's a feat of iron and clay. What does the iron represent? It's Rome. What does the clay represent? Remember, it calls it potter's clay if you use the King James Version. So if we find in Isaiah 64 verse 8, it says, "But thou, Lord, thou art our Father, we are the clay, and thou art our potter, and we are the works of thine hands." And in Jeremiah 18 verse 6 it says, "O house of Israel, cannot do with you as this potter, saith the Lord. Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so ye are mine hand, O house of Israel." So you look at that. What is the clay? It's God's people. So we find a mingling of Roman God's people. Who could that possibly be? The Roman Church. Who's that telling you it is? The Roman Church. What would you call them today? Catholics. Catholicism. So we find that the test will come at the end of time by Catholicism, the papacy. And it is consistent with Daniel chapter 7. And we find, that's just a reformation, we find Ellen White tells us that the mingling of the churchcraft, which is represented by what? The clay. And the statecraft, which is represented by the iron. So we see a mingling of churchcraft and statecraft. So we find that the last test of Daniel 2 is the same as the first, and that we find that we're going to find in Revelation 13 and Revelation 17. Don't worry, I'm not going into Revelation 17. That's almost it is a sermon on its own. But I'm just going to deal more on Revelation 13 at the moment, and that is we're going to find the same thing, because it should be consistent with Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7. And 8 through 12. So let's move on now to Revelation 12. Remember, this is just a recap. So we find in Revelation 12 the woman with the clothed with the sun, moon under her feet, and the stars and the crowns of 12 stars. We won't go into that too much. What we're looking at now is, what is that a symbol of? What is a woman a symbol of in the Bible? A church. Okay, good. You all understand that. And we have the text down there to consolidate that. And we know it's not Mary as per se, because a lot of the Catholic churches believe that that woman is actually physically Mary, because she was about to give birth to the Messiah. But you look at the symbolism there. We find even in Genesis 37:9, it talks about Joseph and his dream, where his father was the sun, his mother was the moon, and his brothers were the stars. So here we see that all that is a representation of the church. So we find that this woman is the church, and the dragon. Well, who is the dragon? Well, we know that it tells us in the minute that the dragon is the devil, because it says in the verse, it doesn't leave us in any doubt, does it? In verse 9, it says that called the devil, the Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. But what we're looking at here now is the heads and the tails. Because we're looking at here what they all mean something. So the Bible doesn't give us any ambiguity. So we find here that in Isaiah 9 verse 15 it tells us what the heads and the tails mean. It says the ancient, or the wise in brackets, and honourable, he is the head, and the prophet that teacheth lies, he is the tail. So when we look at that prophecy, what is that telling us? Well, we find that the stars of heaven were, the tail drew a third part of the stars of heaven. Now, the stars of heaven, who are they representing? The angels, that's right. That's right, because you have the angels representing by stars. We can go through many of those, but the Bible verses, but we won't. So does that telling us a story? How did Satan lure 1/3 of the angels? He prophesied lies. That's right. He told them there's better things coming, and I bet you they wish they hadn't heard that. What's the symbol of the horns? Well, we find that the symbol in the horns in these, all these prophecies really is a symbol of kings or kingdoms. We find that in Daniel chapter 8 and Revelation 17. So we find that these are symbols of kingdoms. So we find that the head, I actually didn't know, I think I should actually go back there. I forgot to actually talk about the head. I was too busy talking about the tail. So what does the head represent? Well, it says that the ancient and the wise men he is the head. What is the ancient and wise men in the Bible? Well, fortunately, it doesn't leave us to conjecture, does it? The Bible tells us. And it says here that in Numbers 11:16, the 70 men of the elders of Israel, thou knowest that the elders of the people, that bring them into the tabernacle of the congregation. So we see that the elders or the ancients have something to do with the temple service. So they have something to do with the religious service. And in Ezekiel 8:11 it talks about the 70 men, the ancients of the house of Israel. They stood every man with his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. So the heads here represent the ancients of Israel. And who are the ancients of Israel? Those who minister in the temple. So it has to do with the religious service. So here we find that we have the heads representing the religious service. Oops, that's me. Going back. The heads represent the religious service. The horns represent the kings or the civil power. So here we find that all these beasts, kingdoms, have to do with church and state. They are church and state. So we find that the test is coming is all through religious and civil power. A church and state combination. Yes, that's correct. So here we find, if we're moving along now to Revelation 13, it says, and I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So here we find this test, this complete test is coming by this beast, and it is a religio-political power. In other words, it's civil as well as religious. It's a church and state power. And it's interesting to note, where was John standing when he saw this beast rise out of the sea? Well, he was in Patmos, but in the vision, where does he say he was? He says, I stood upon the what? Sand of the sea. So if he's on the sand of the sea, does everything in this prophecy have a symbol or not? It does. God is telling you through the numbering system, for everything he sees. It all has meaning. So what does the sand of the sea mean in prophecy? Well, you look in Isaiah and the many other verses, if I don't just pick this one. For though thy people be as the what? Sand of the sea. Yet the remnant of them shall return, the consumption deed shall not overthrow with righteousness. So we can see that the sand of the sea is representing who? Yes, us, God's people. And it stands to reason. John is standing where God's people are. And he's looking at this power. And this power came out of where? Came out of the sea. And what does the sea do? Yeah, it spits out and it breaks upon the sand. So we can see this power is coming out of the sea and coming over to where? It's coming over to the sand. It's coming for you. And yeah, that's right. There are so many parallels you can go to. So we can see this power is coming after the sand of the sea. It's coming after you. Because you and I believe, are the remnant of Israel. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and the beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So here we find, once again, this 7 heads and 10 horns scenario. So we go back and we find this beast is very interesting because it has little bits of Daniel chapter 7 in it. So we find that it has this beast which has like unto a leopard. So it has a body unto a leopard. Now, what was the leopard in Daniel chapter 7? Do you remember what that beast was? It was Greece. So whatever this beast power is, it is primarily what? Yes, and it's Greek. Greek in its philosophy, Greek in its body, its being. And secondly, it had the feet of a bear. So what is the bear? Actually someone said Russian, because we think the Russian bear, but we're talking about in prophecy. It's Medo-Persia, yeah. It was the second kingdom. So we find that this power has some traits of the Medo-Persians. And it also had the mouth of a lion. So it has the traits of what other Babylon. Okay, but that's not its last description. And it said, and the dragon gave him his power, seat, and great authority. Now, who's the dragon? It's Satan. So is this a benevolent power or is it a satanic one? A satanic one. So we find that this power coming up out of the sea and coming after God's people. Yep, there we go. And it says here, and I saw one of its head were wounded unto death, and his deadly wound was healed. And the world wondered after the beast, and there was given unto him mouth to speak great blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 40 and 2 months. Now, I put in brackets under there 126 years. 1,260 years. That is consistent with other prophecies, which we're not going to go into today. That's why I've put them down there. You can see down here in Revelation, it's got all those there. We're talking about the 1,260 days. I can see it just there. And the 42 months and the time and half and time, 3.5 years. All these point to the same power. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, who was the power at the end of time? Yeah. No, it starts with Babylon. When we get down to the feet, who did we say was the last power? The Roman Church. That's right. In Daniel chapter 7, who was the last power mentioned? The little horn was the Roman Church. That's correct. So it stands to reason, who is this going to represent? The Roman Church. Because this one goes down from the time of the papacy right down through to the time of the end of time. So it has to be none other than the papacy. And it was given to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So you see, he's coming out onto the sand and making war and overcoming. So that is the thrust of Revelation 13. But then Revelation 13 takes a little bit of a turn, which I found very interesting. All of a sudden, it comes up with this other beast. This beast is never mentioned anywhere else. Why is it coming here now? First of all, let's have a look at who this beast is. Okay, so we find here in Revelation 13 verse 11, it says, and I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. So if you're on the beach and you've got the sea in front of you, where's the earth? Behind you. So are you starting to feel a little bit sandwiched? We're in the middle of something, aren't we? We're being attacked from the front. Are we being attacked from behind as well? Let's have a look. Yes, so we find that, well, let's have a look at the beast. It helps us to find out what these symbols mean, and it gives us a description to identify. So we first see that he saw another beast coming up out of the earth, so we'll find out where the earth is, and it had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spake as a dragon. So there's a lot going in there. So let's have a look in there. First of all, what is a lamb a symbol of in the Bible? Christ, yes. We find that in there. In 1 John 1:2, behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world. So this nation automatically tells me what type of nation is it. It's a Christian nation. Whatever it is, it's Christian in its origins. But then it says that he spake as a dragon. Does that mean it's always going to stay Christian? No. No. It's going to turn and become satanic. So if waters represents populated areas, because we find this in Revelation 17, the waters which thou sawest, or the seas, which the horse is, are the peoples, multitudes, nations and tongues. So it stands to reason that wherever the earth is that in the water or out of the water? That means how populated is it? Sparsely populated, barely populated. So we're going to find that this nation, when it comes up from a sparsely populated area. And it's Christian, and it also helps, interesting enough here, it also helps the woman. Have a look in Revelation 12, verse 14. It says, "And the woman was given 2 wings of an eagle, that she may fly into the wilderness and into her place, and she shall be nourished for time and half a time." What prophecies is that referring to? That's the 1260 years. That's the papal reign. So we're now having a time frame here. So we find that this is now happening after the papal reign. And it says, "And the serpent cast out his mouth as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood." But notice what it says here. "And the what? The earth helped the woman." So the earth helped the woman and opened up her mouth and swallowed up the flood. So is the earth, which is what this nation came up out of, did it help or persecute the woman? It says it helped. So to start off, it helped with it. And here's another indicator. So the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make the war with the remnant of her seed, which shall what? Keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. What woman or church keeps the commandment, professes to keep the commandment of God? It's Seventh-day Adventists. So wherever we see this kingdom, Seventh-day Adventism should be its home, its birthplace. True? There's only one country that fits, and that is the United States of America. Because the United States of America came into being right after the papacy went into supremacy. It started to rise. And it is also the birthplace of Seventh-day Adventism. So we find that right on time, the second beast arrives and does its job. But that's not the end of the story with this beast, because we have a look on it here. It says initially it helps the woman, but let's go on, because we stop and think of Revelation 13, we think of the papacy, causing the mark of the beast and etc. and so on, but that's not what the Bible says. Who instigates the mark of the beast? It's this one. It's the second beast. It's the second beast. So we find here that it says in verse 12, "And he exercises all the power of the first beast before him," that's the beast coming out of the sea, "and causes all them that dwell upon the earth to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed." So that's the after 1260 years, 538 to 1798. And notice down here, and it says, "And deceiveth them that dwell upon the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast." Well, that's the first beast, that is. "That they should make an image to the beast, which was wounded by the sword and did live." What did you find that this power does? What does it say? It says in verse 14. What's the first thing it does? It deceives. But is it a religious power as well? Does it have, remember, it's a Christian power, so does it claim to be Christian? Yes, it does. But notice what it does in verse 15. "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast. The beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be" what? Killed. Okay, so there comes the death decree that is consistent everywhere else we find. And we find that it says also that no man should buy or sell save he that have what? The mark of the beast, or the number of his name, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Okay. You know, there's a reason why this beast is introduced. Because in Revelation 12, you had two sections of the beast, didn't you? You had the head and the horns, and what was the other section? Its tail. Here we find we have this other beast. We have the head and the horns, so it stands to reason. What would this one be? What would this other beast be? It should be the tail. For we find in Revelation 4, it says, and he drew a third of the part of the stars of heaven to the earth. And remember, the tail is what? In Isaiah 15 verse 9, the prophet that teacheth lies, he is the tail. When a prophet teaches lies, what's he exercising? What's he practicing? Deception. That's right. He deceived them. And what was the role of the second beast? Is to deceive them that dwell upon the earth. So you can see that now Revelation 13 is really just a type of Revelation 12. It's just continuing on with the next story. And if you go to Revelation 17, it does the same thing again. So we see now that the reason there's a description of this second beast is just a description of the tail of Revelation 12 and its role in the role it plays in the final events. And because really, when you stop and look at it, is the tail separated from the beast, or is it part of the beast? It's part of it. So really, when you stop and look at it, when we look at the US, we're going to find that it is very much a part of the papacy. Yes. So right on time, America rises into world power, just as the Bible prophecy predicted. And it really came to prominence after the wound was, healed or started to be healed in 1929. America came on right on scene. First of all, let's have a look what the master of the beast is. We should actually deal with that because sometimes, you assume people know things, but we'll quickly go through what the mark of the beast is. Some people, you look online, they think it's an implanted microchip. Other people think it's the tattoo, you got a tattoo in the hand and the forehead. These are maybe methods that they use, but it's not the mark of the beast because really it's a symbolic. Some people even think that COVID vaccine was the mark of the beast. You receive it, because you couldn't buy or sell. Does that sound familiar? You can understand why people think along those lines. But really, the Bible clearly tells us what the mark of the beast is, and most of us should know these being good Adventists, but I'll read just a couple of verses. The one I like the best because it's very clear, and if you want to just give one verse, this would be pretty well much sum it up. In Exodus 13 verse 9, and it shall be a sign or a mark upon thine hand and a memorial from between thine eyes. So you have something on your hand and in your forehead. And that the Lord's what? Law may be on thy mouth. For strong is the hand of the Lord that brought thee out of Egypt. So we find that whatever this mark is, it has something to do with what? The law of God. Okay? So the mark of God is the law of God. And we find in other verses, for Ezekiel and Ezekiel 20:12, that I gave them my Sabbaths to be my sign, that we find that in the Lord's law, the Sabbath is the sign or the mark of God's ownership of you, really. And so Satan, it stands to reason that Satan will have his own mark, his own day, and which we know to be Sunday. So we find that who should we be watching if we want to see where we are in Earth's history? We've got to be watching who? We've got to be watching the papacy and the United States, because those two are the major players, the Bible has told us, will be the major players of end-time events. So this is who we should be watching for. And don't you find that when you have a look at this picture, don't they look similar? The similar architecture. You've got the St. Peter's Basilica, you've got the White House. Here you have the obelisk in the middle of the solar wheel. But over here, you'll see down here, I don't know, it's a bit hard to see, but you can see they have the obelisk at the end. But if you have a look at Washington's layout, they have a solar wheel. Now, come on. You can't tell me that that's coincidental. God, in his foreknowledge, foresaw all these events. And they, yes, that's right, they both face, yes, that's right. The similarities are just relentless. And here we say that, does the America worship the first beast? Oh, you bet your bottom dollar it does. Here we find, this photo's old, but here we see President Bush and Clinton and the others, heads of state, all when Pope John Paul II died. You know, if the General Conference President of the Seventh-day Adventists died, do you think we'd have the presidents, all the other leaders of the world come around and, do that? No. What does that tell you about the papacy? Oh, you know who the boss is. And all the little servants come around and pay their respects. Yes, that's right, they're kneeling down and they're in black, which is a sign of penitence. You know, where are we in Earth's history? You know, I can't time set, you can't set dates, okay, I understand that. But you know, does Satan know when Jesus is coming back? No, he doesn't. So does he have to guess? He has to guess. So really, if you want to see where we are in Earth, just have a look at what Satan's doing, because he is certainly busy. You know, we have a look at the United States, you know, is the United States getting stronger and stronger or in decline? Well, yeah, it's getting stronger, but like the Romans of old, they're sort of almost self-destructing, aren't they? They're getting weaker. They're strong militarily. They're still the greatest superpower at the moment. But people are predicting in about 2030 that China will overtake them. So if we know that the US is going to be the major last player, not China, how much time do you think we have left? Now, God knows the future. I mean, China could suddenly collapse and never happens, but can you see that where we are in Earth's history? But you have to stop and think, you know, Australia, when we were invaded last time, when was the last time Australia was invaded? It was the Second World War, when the Japanese tried to invade. Who saved us? We could say Jesus saved us, but who saved us? The United States. You know, the United States is a world superpower. You know, everyone bags the United States, and they deserve a lot of bagging at times. But really, when you have a strong superpower, how much of the world order is in check? They keep the world in order. That's exactly right. What happens when a superpower collapses? Oh, yeah, it's exactly right. We get something like the Ukraine. You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, my goodness me, what happened in all the former Soviet states? There was civil war. Now, if the US is keeping the world in check, what happens when Ellen White tells us when national apostasy happens, it will end in what? National ruin. So if the United States is no longer there to back us up, who do you think is going to be looking to us as, yeah, exactly right, China, Indonesia, any other country? Has Australia got a great military power, or are we really mediocre? We're very much dependent on the US. So when National Sunday laws come and national ruin comes, because that's what Ellen White tells us and the Bible tells us, that the ruin of the United States will come, where does that leave us? It leaves us exposed. So you do not think that because we live hundreds of miles away from all the rest of the world that we are going to be left out of it. You know, Howard think we only enjoy peace and safety because the US keeps us there. And when that goes, we go. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. There is so much. There are so many we could go into there. You know, the danger, of course, you know, when you start setting dates and times is that it's the boy who cried wolf. You know, you say, Jesus is going to come in such and such a time. Is Jesus coming soon? What happens to people we know when we start saying Jesus is coming soon? Yeah, he's coming. I've heard it all before. People have told me this and that date's come and gone. You know, so there's a real risk and danger of starting to set dates. But, however, You know my theory, my little pet theory, the third and the fourth generation, is we find that the fourth generation is when God delivers or delivers up his judgments. So we find this in, a classic example of this is Genesis 15 verse 6. The fourth generation shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. And I've got other examples there. So we find that at the end of the fourth generation, God says that's it, time's up. So we find that, now remember Satan doesn't know when Jesus is coming back. So do you think Satan is looking for when God might do something? So well, I've already had a look at here. I just looked in history and just had a look and see what major events came around. You have a look, when you look at 1844, because that's the first one I thought of, how many generations are after that? It actually comes down to 2004. Now, if you're Satan, are you going to wait until 2004 comes along, or are you going to try and do something just before it comes around? You'd try and do something beforehand, wouldn't you? Yeah, to get yourself ready, because, if Jesus decides to come in that fourth generation, well, you've got to get yourself ready. What happened in 2001? We had September what? September 11, 2001. And what happened? The world changed. The quote was, "The world will never be the same." Because from that day forward, security and freedoms were restricted hugely. And today we don't think about it. But before then, you could just hop on a plane. I could have a knife. I could have whatever I wanted on my body with relative safety. Now, if I even go with a glass of water, they're going to think I'm a bomber. So it's, things changed. But there's another date which I look at, which I find very interesting, is that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is God's End Day Church, was founded in 1863. So if you go right down to the fourth generation, where does that put us? 2023. When's that from our present day? Next year. So what happened? So Satan, true to form, if we're true to form, did he do anything to try and get things ready before that date? Oh, yeah. Isn't that just a coincidence that a couple of years before that date that he instigates COVID? And we have lockdowns. And were our restrictions even more restricted? More restricted? You bet your bottom dollar they were. They now could tell they've done more in this one than they did in the previous one. Because now, I don't know if you were out there, I remember being in that, a lot of tradies. A lot of my tradie friends thought this is a load of bunkum, this is a load of rubbish, we're just going to go out there and work. But when we got lockdowns, they said, you know what? You are not to leave your house unless you get vaccinated. When you stop and look at that, what are they ultimately saying? If you can't leave your house to earn money, you cannot earn a living. Is that true? That means you can't what? Buy or sell. And we all went along with it. Okay, not all of us, yeah. Majority of people. They have found what they can do and how we will respond. They tested us, and we capitulated. So now we can see that they had a dry run for the mark of the beast, buying and selling. Can you see that these are all happening? And you have another look here at Millennial Week. This is another interesting one I found, that Ellen White tells us that from the time of the wilderness temptation, anyone heard of the Millennial Week, where they believe every 1,000 years is a week of creation? Anyway, be that as it may, they believe that 6,000 years will end in round about 27 AD through to 2027. How far away is that? Another 3 or 4 years. Can you see how things are starting to focus? So we have a look at those. We get there at. I'll go back to that. Have you noticed that the end of the fourth generation is 2023? Christ's baptism was exactly 2,000 years ago in 2027. Can you see all these 3.5 year gaps starting to happen? So we can find that things are really starting to heaten up. because Satan doesn't know when, so he has to get ready for each of these events. And so we can see that he's getting ready, getting ready, getting ready. Are we? But we find that over and over again, we find these allegories in the Bible of when Jesus tries to come, where does he find his people? Sleeping, unprepared, unawake. Sleeping. So we find that when we look for the weather forecast to prepare for tomorrow, don't we? So if we want to know what the weather's going to be like, what do? You go to the weather forecast and see what it's going to be like. Well, here we have our forecast. And what is the forecast telling? A storm is coming. A storm is coming. And that storm, you know, we may not see it from the Bible, we may not recognise it, but I tell you what, if I saw that coming, what would you know is coming? Yeah, rain is coming. A storm is coming. The dark clouds are rumbling. That's right, the dark clouds are rumbling. You know, I've put this little montage together in as far as, you know, sometimes when you stop back, you know, things happen slowly, but when you put them together, you're there going, wow. So we've had, in the last few years, we've had COVID-19 shutdowns, global shutdowns, never happened before in the history of the world, ever. And when that happened, they made these sorts of noises. I don't know if this will come through on audio, but I hope it will. No, let me... Oh, it's a shame. The audio is not coming through on these, but when it comes through, this is all talking about what they were planning when the global shutdown had happened. It was, notice what the pictures they used. They used the climate. Notice the climate. Climate is heavily involved in the new order that they want to bring around. And notice what they said down the bottom there. The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window opportunity to reflect and reimagine and to what? Reset our world. And this is the big sign, this is the catch cry it says over there. It says, you will own how much? Nothing, and you will be happy. This is from the World Economic Forum. So we find that financial collapse, you know what? Ever since 2000, who remembers the financial crisis of 2008? That feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? But you know, ever since that time, they haven't stopped printing money. That's how they've been keeping us going. Dropping interest rates and pumping money. Do you know what happens when you just keep dropping interest rates and keep pumping money? What is the natural consequence of that? It's inflation. That's right. Have you started to notice now, conveniently, now, inflation is going where? It's going through the roof. Coming right up to what date? 2023. How convenient. And that's not the only thing that's happening. Have you noticed that free speech is now a thing of the past? If you say anything against anyone's sexual orientation, or, you know, you have to use the right pronouns, you know, they, them, theirs. What is a woman? They can't even give you a definition of what a woman is now. I mean, it's just ludicrous. And if you say anything against them, what happens to you? Oh, yeah, you are given either strict financial, and it's even prison time. So we're finding now that the hate crimes and free speech are disappearing fast. You know, just 40, 50 years ago, could you say any of these things? Could you even condemn, you know, homosexuality, you know, 50 odd years ago? Yeah, without any fear or favour. Would you be game to say it now? Yeah. Without persecution? No. That's right. I was hoping to actually show you this one, but because the audio is not going to go, I'll just quickly go through this one. This one's talking about Sri Lanka, and he's talking about how, with the Green New Deal, they're talking about how they were going to, how they're affecting farming. And have anyone heard about what's happened in Sri Lanka? Oh yeah, Sri Lanka is in big trouble. We find that behold our future. This is the future that we're going to have. You know, we tend to think that this can't happen, but Sri Lanka was a rich country, was quite prosperous, could feed itself, and this is the result of what their policies have made. When they go down this Green Deal, it sent them bankrupt. They have inflation at 50%. You know, and they can't, people are starving. People are actually starving to death. And this is the natural result. Turmoil, tumults and turmoil. You know, the powers that be like to do little test runs first before they do anything major. Do you remember when the global financial crisis happened and Greece was in the verge of bankruptcy? What was one of the plans that they did to actually get Greece out of trouble? Well, they printed more money, but the other thing they did was they actually stole everyone's bank account. They took half. They took half of what you owned. So if you have money in the bank, how safe do you think that's going to be? It's not. No, it's not. Yeah, under your mattress. Money will become worthless. And you can see that it's coming to, so we'll just finish on that because, right. Also, have you noticed that they're out of the US, they're now suddenly, conveniently, releasing UFO footage. They've never done that before in their history, never even acknowledged that any of this existed. Conveniently now, just before 2023, they're now releasing what they have on UFOs. You might say, well, so what? Yes, it's a delusion. Because if the UFOs exist, what does that say about the Bible? The Bible cannot be trusted because the Bible doesn't say UFOs exist. The Bible says that you and I are made in the image of God. You know, so you can see that they pumped that out, so it's very convenient. And of course we have the war in Ukraine and the very real threat of nuclear war. Oh, I wish the audio was going on that, but it talks about the imminent threat that the Russians are said, yeah, we're going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Anyone know what a tactical nuclear weapon is? It's only a small one, that's right. We tend to think of nuclear bombs that go from and it takes out, 30 square miles of, tactical nukes are designed to take out something smaller. Yes, so that's what and they said they're going to use them. It'll be the first time since World War II that nuclear weapons will be used. And they're going to use it. How do you see this war in Ukraine panning out? I can see this coming as World War III. The trouble is, we're not running around like a mad flat panic, because if this normally, we'd be running around going, oh my goodness me, the end of the world is coming. Why don't we run around in a mad flat panic? Because this is not the first time it's happened, has it? Anyone remember the Cuban Missile Crisis back in the 1960s? So in the back of our mind we've gone, oh, you know what, this has happened before, threatened nuclear war, but, we got past it. And, I tend to think that this is going to just blow over again because it has done it in the past. But, God is sending us warnings, to try and wake us up. I'm coming to the end now, I promise. Noah warned for 120 years that the flood was coming. How many of them ended up getting to the boat? Just he and his family. He has to be either the worst creature on the face of the planet or he was pushing uphill. And my money's on the fact that he was pushing uphill because people didn't want to hear, even though they saw the animals walk into the ark, even though they witnessed all these things, they still refused. If you were there, what would you have done? If I saw the animals going on their own, would you have gotten onto the ark? I'd be there going, of course. I'd be there going, count me in. But it was the delays. It was the delays, the ridiculing, the lethargy, I'll get there, I'll get round to it eventually. That type of thinking cost them their lives. Ellen White tells us that, I'll only read the one in the middle there where she says, we shall not recognise the manifestations of the Holy Spirit of the latter rain. It may be falling on our hearts, on hearts all around us, but we shall not discern discern or receive it. You know that the latter rain could be falling right now, and she says there are people who are in the church, she was talking about those, who have received the greater light, who do not discern that the latter rain is falling. How do you know if the latter rain's falling around you now? Do you know? You don't. Because the fact is, it may be falling and you don't know it. So, she says the agencies of evil are combining their forces and consolidating. Can you see that? Would you say that statement rings true today? You bet it is. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. Great changes are soon to take place in our world, and the final movements will be what? Rapid ones. You know, with COVID taught me one lesson that was anything like that. You can be shut down in how long? Overnight. And boom. You know, what's going to happen next? What's it going to take us next to wake us up out of our lethargy? Because, you know, we tend to look at that and just say, oh, well, I've heard Sunday laws are coming for... How long have we been in the church? I know I've been in the church since 94, so I've been, for nearly 30 years now. And I've been hearing it, you've been hearing it, and we tend to sit there and go, well, I've heard it again. You know, we tend to realise that we need to lift up our heads and look and see that the Lord is coming soon. Satan is getting ready, and I think it's the fact is that we need to be ready. Oops. So, that's my son's laptop. So we need to be ready for when the Lord comes, because we tend to be so lethargic, and we, you know, it's like the old adage, the frog in the boiling pot. They're slowly turning up the heat, and we're just going, yeah, it's not hot enough for me to hop out. We need to be watching and be ready, because the Bible prophecy of old tells us that how many of the virgins slept? They all slept. They all slept. But there was a difference between the two. 5 of them had insufficient oil, the other had extra oil. And that extra oil is that experience, that relationship with God that you and I need now. Because how confident would you be if we suddenly woke up tomorrow morning and saw Sunday laws were in? What condition would you be ready to meet your Saviour? That's really the question. Are you ready to meet? And if the answer is no, thank God it's not here yet. We still have time to get ready. You know, the angel, the messenger, or the Lord's messenger tells us, get ready, get ready, get ready. You know, the Lord is coming, and another year has gone by. It just went like that. And we won't be long before we come to the end of the 4th generation. And who knows? It may happen then. It may not. The Lord in His mercy may extend it. But are you prepared to take the risk? Let's end with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, I thank you, Lord, so much for the warnings you have given to us in your word. We know you are in control, and that none of these are surprises to you, and you have foreseen all these events. And I pray, Lord, that you will help us to wake us out of our lethargy, our carelessness. We seem to have an indifference to our own salvation. But we know, Lord, that you love us more than we love ourselves, and that you are not willing for any to perish, but all to come to you to have everlasting life. And I pray, Lord, that you will help us for that great day when you shall come again. We know that we have a testing time before us, and I pray that you will help us to be ready for that great test when you shall come again in the clouds of glory, and that we shall reside with you forever. We ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.